Welcome back to SCOTUS Oral Arguments and Opinions. Today, the Supreme Court handed down 6 yes-6 decisions. We'll dissect each of them starting with Ames versus Ohio Department of Youth Services, case number 23-1039. I'll walk through the opinion, give my thoughts on case implications, and also compare how the oral arguments compared and contrasted to the ultimate opinions. Spoiler alert, oral arguments heavily forecasted the results. Please note that this episode is read by an automated voice. The question presented in this case is whether, in addition to pleading the other elements of Title VII, a majority group plaintiff must show background circumstances to support the suspicion that the defendant is that unusual employer who discriminates against the majority. The Supreme Court held the majority group plaintiff do not need to show background circumstances to support the suspicion. Justice Jackson delivered the opinion for a unanimous court. Justice Thomas filed a concurring opinion in which Justice Gorsuch joined.
Justice Jackson's unanimous opinion, petitioner Marlene Ames, a heterosexual woman, has worked for the Ohio Department of Youth Services in various roles since 2004. In 2019, the agency interviewed Ames for a new management position, but ultimately hired another candidate, a lesbian woman. The agency subsequently demoted Ames from her role as a program administrator and later hired a gay man to fill that role. Ames then filed this lawsuit against the agency under Title VII, alleging that she was denied the management promotion and demoted because of her sexual orientation. The district court granted summary judgment to the agency and the Sixth Circuit affirmed. The courts below analyzed Ames's claims under McDonnell Douglas Corp. v. Green, which sets forth the traditional framework for evaluating disparate treatment claims that rest on circumstantial evidence. At the first step of that framework, the plaintiff must make a prima facie showing that the defendant acted with a discriminatory motive. Like the district court, the Sixth Circuit held that Ames had failed to meet her prima facie burden because she had not shown background circumstances to support the suspicion that the defendant is that unusual employer who discriminates against the majority. The court reasoned that Ames, as a straight woman, was required to make this showing in addition to the usual ones for establishing a prima facie case. Held, the Sixth Circuit's background circumstances rule, which requires members of a majority group to satisfy a heightened evidentiary standard to prevail on a Title VII claim, cannot be squared with the text of Title VII or the court's precedents. A. Title VII's disparate treatment provision bars employers from intentionally discriminating against their employees on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. For most plaintiffs, the first step of the McDonnell-Douglas framework, stating a prima facie case of discrimination, is not onerous. The Sixth Circuit's background circumstances rule requires plaintiffs who are members of a majority group to bear an additional burden at step 1. But the text of Title VII's disparate treatment provision draws no distinctions between majority group plaintiffs and minority group plaintiffs. The provision focuses on individuals rather than groups, barring discrimination against any individual because of protected characteristics. Congress left no room for courts to impose special requirements on majority group plaintiffs alone. This court's precedents reinforce that understanding of the statute and make clear that the standard for proving disparate treatment under Title VII does not vary based on whether or not the plaintiff is a member of a majority group. Moreover, the background circumstances rule, which subjects all majority group plaintiffs to the same highly specific evidentiary standard in every case, ignores the court's instruction to avoid inflexible applications of the prima facie standard. B. Ohio argues that the background circumstances rule does not subject majority group plaintiffs to a heightened evidentiary standard, but rather is just another way of asking whether the circumstances surrounding an employment decision, if otherwise unexplained, suggest that the decision was because of a protected characteristic. Ohio's recasting is directly at odds with the Sixth Circuit's description of the background circumstances rule and its application of that rule in this case. Ohio's alternative argument that Ames's Title VII claims would fail even absent the background circumstances rule is for the courts below to consider in the first instance on remand. vacated and remanded.
Justice Thomas's concurring opinion. I join the court's opinion in full. I write separately to highlight the problems that arise when judges create atextual legal rules and frameworks. Judge-made doctrines have a tendency to distort the underlying statutory text, impose unnecessary burdens on litigants, and cause confusion for courts. The background circumstances rule, correctly rejected by the court today, is one example of this phenomenon, and the decision below involves another example. The Sixth Circuit analyzed Ames's Title VII claim under the three-step framework developed by this court in McDonnell Douglas Corp. V. Green. As with the background circumstances rule, the McDonnell Douglas framework lacks any basis in the text of Title VII and has proved difficult for courts to apply. In a case where the parties ask us to do so, I would be willing to consider whether the McDonnell Douglas framework is a workable and useful evidentiary tool. The Sixth Circuit's background circumstances rule imposes a heightened burden on Title VII plaintiffs who belong to so-called majority groups. The rule requires a majority group plaintiff to prove, in addition to the standard elements of a Title VII claim, that background circumstances support the suspicion that the defendant is that unusual employer who discriminates against the majority. This additional requirement is a paradigmatic example of how judge-made doctrines can distort the underlying statutory text. As the court's opinion explains, the background circumstances rule lacks any basis in the text of Title VII. Title VII bars employment discrimination against any individual because of such individual's race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. Thus, to state the obvious, the statute bars discrimination against any individual on the grounds specified therein. The background circumstances rule plainly contravenes that statutory command by imposing a higher burden on some individuals based solely on their membership in a particular demographic group. This rule is a product of improper judicial lawmaking. The rule was created by D.C. Circuit judges in Parker v. Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Company, 652 F. 2nd 1012, 1981. Applying their own common sense, these judges determined that extra evidence is required to prove discrimination when a Title VII plaintiff is white. In support of this proposition, the court cited only its mistaken understanding of the McDonnell-Douglas framework, another judge-made construct. At no point in its development of this new rule did the court refer to the text of Title VII. The background circumstances rule also highlights how judge-made doctrines can be difficult for courts to apply because courts lack an underlying legal authority on which to ground their analysis. There is no principled way to resolve doctrinal ambiguities. The background circumstances rule suffers from this flaw. A number of courts have described the rule as vague and ill-defined. Most notably, the background circumstances rule requires courts to perform the difficult, if not impossible, task of deciding whether a particular plaintiff qualifies as a member of the so-called majority. How a court defines the boundaries of a population can affect whether a particular person falls into a majority or minority group. Women, for example, make up the majority in the United States as a whole, but not in some states and counties. Similarly, women make up the majority of employees in certain industries such as teaching and nursing, but the minority in other industries such as construction. Defining the majority is even more difficult in the context of race, as racial categories tend to be overbroad and imprecise in many ways. American families have become increasingly multicultural, and attempts to divide us all up into a handful of groups have become only more incoherent with time. And even if courts could identify all the relevant racial groups and their boundaries, courts would still struggle to determine which racial groups make up a majority. Black employees in Detroit, for example, make up a majority in their city, but not in Michigan or the United States at large. Similar problems arise with religion. As with sex and race, a particular religion could make up the majority or the minority, depending on how the population is defined. And in the context of religion, the background circumstances majority, or the minority, depending on how the population is defined. And in the context of religion, the background circumstances rule requires courts to decide both the plaintiff is religion and how the plaintiff is religion compares with the religion of everyone else in the relevant population. Those tasks are formidable, as Americans hold a wide range of religious beliefs, as well as a wide range of views about the proper way to categorize other religions. Americans have different views, for example, on whether Catholics are Christians. The judicial process is singularly ill-equipped to resolve these kinds of faith-based differences. Most courts appear to have sidestepped these difficulties by abandoning the search for neutral principles and instead assuming that the background circumstances rule applies only to white and male plaintiffs. The 10th Circuit, for example, assumed that the rule applies to white plaintiffs on the ground that white individuals are members of a historically favored group. Similarly, the D.C. Circuit applied the rule to a white plaintiff while acknowledging that, of course, whites are in the minority in the District of Columbia. In other words, courts with this rule have enshrined into Title VII's anti-discrimination law an explicitly race-based preference. White plaintiffs must prove the existence of background circumstances, while non-white plaintiffs need not do so. Such a rule is undoubtedly contrary to Title VII and likely violates the Constitution, under which there can be no such thing as either a creditor or a debtor race. Thankfully, today's decision obviates the need for courts to engage in the sordid business of divvying us up by race or any other protected trait. I simply observe that the background circumstances rule is emblematic of the serious challenges that can arise when judges invent atextual requirements. For too long, that rule put a deep scratch across the surface of Title VII. I am pleased that the court rejects it in full today. This case involves a second judge-made rule. Relying on circuit precedent, the Sixth Circuit applied the three-step framework developed by this court in McDonnell-Douglas to determine whether Ames's Title VII claim should survive summary judgment. The court today assumes, without deciding, that the McDonnell-Douglas framework is an appropriate tool for making that determination. But the judge-made McDonnell-Douglas framework has no basis in the text of Title VII. And, as I have previously explained, lower courts' extension of this doctrine into the summary judgment context has caused significant confusion and troubling outcomes on the ground. In an appropriate case, this court should consider whether the McDonnell-Douglas framework is an appropriate tool to evaluate Title VII claims at summary judgment. The McDonnell-Douglas framework is a judge-made evidentiary tool. It was originally developed for courts to use in a bench trial. Its intended purpose was to help bring the litigants in the court expeditiously and fairly to the ultimate question in a Title VII case, that is, whether the defendant intentionally discriminated against the plaintiff. The framework has 3 steps, which this court has summarized as follows. First, the plaintiff has the burden of proving by the preponderance of the evidence a prima facie case of discrimination. Second, if the plaintiff succeeds in proving the prima facie case, the burden shifts to the defendant to articulate some legitimate, non-discriminatory reason for the employee's rejection. Third, should the defendant carry this burden, the plaintiff must then have an opportunity to prove by a preponderance of the evidence that the legitimate reasons offered by the defendant were not its true reasons, but were a pretext for discrimination. The McDonnell-Douglas framework was made out of whole cloth. Its contours have no basis in the text of Title VII or any other source of law. And as far as I can tell, this court has never attempted to justify it on textual grounds. The McDonnell-Douglas framework exemplifies how judge-made doctrines can have amorphous bounds. Although originally designed for the bench trial context, the McDonnell-Douglas framework has over the years taken on a life of its own. It is today the presumptive means of resolving Title VII cases at summary judgment. And that development has come without this court ever considering, much less holding, that the framework is an appropriate tool for the summary judgment task. Far from extending the framework to new contexts, this court has taken steps to limit the relevancy and applicability of the McDonnell-Douglas framework. For example, this court has held that McDonnell-Douglas is inapplicable when the plaintiff relies on direct evidence to prove his claim. The court has also held that the framework does not apply in Title VII mixed motive cases. We have said that the framework is inapplicable at the pleading stage and in deciding post-trial motions. This court has further explained that a plaintiff need not satisfy the first step of the framework at trial. And we have strongly suggested that the framework should not be referenced in jury instructions because it is too confusing. Notwithstanding this court's steps to limit McDonnell-Douglas, it is now the framework that courts typically apply to determine whether the plaintiff has proffered sufficient evidence to survive summary judgment. The reason for this expansion is unclear. This court has only once addressed the application of McDonnell-Douglas to Title VII cases at summary judgment, and it held that the framework did not apply. But however we got here, McDonnell-Douglas now undeniably plays a prominent role in Title VII cases at summary judgment. Atextual, judge-created legal rules have a tendency to generate complexity, confusion, and erroneous results. I am pleased that the court correctly rejects the atextual background circumstances rule today.
Case implications. The Supreme Court's unanimous decision in Ames versus Ohio establishes a clear principle that Title VII's protections apply equally to all individuals regardless of their majority or minority group status. By rejecting the Sixth Circuit's background circumstances rule, the court reinforces that the McDonnell-Douglas framework imposes the same evidentiary burden on all plaintiffs, regardless of protected characteristics. This ruling promotes consistency in Title VII litigation across all circuits and eliminates what Justice Thomas characterized as a deep scratch across the surface of Title VII. Employers and lower courts must now apply the same prima facie standards to all discrimination claims, potentially increasing litigation efficiency by eliminating threshold disputes about a plaintiff's group status. Justice Thomas's concurrence, while agreeing with the majority's conclusion, raises broader questions about the continued viability of the McDonnell-Douglas framework itself, particularly at the summary judgment stage. The concurrence signals potential future challenges to this framework, characterizing it as a judge-made doctrine lacking textual foundation. This may invite future litigants to question whether McDonnell-Douglas remains an appropriate analytical tool, especially given its complexity and the difficulties courts have encountered in its application. Lower courts may now face the challenge of applying a uniform prima facie standard while simultaneously grappling with renewed questions about the overall framework's utility in Title VII cases, particularly at summary judgment. Now, let's turn to a comparison of the oral arguments. What's fascinating about comparing the oral arguments to the final opinion is how clearly the court telegraphed where this was heading. During arguments, Justice Kavanaugh essentially asked the petitioner's lawyer if all they wanted was a really short opinion that says discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, whether it's because you're gay or because you're straight, is prohibited, and the rules are the same, whichever way that goes. And that's essentially what the court delivered. Justice Jackson's unanimous opinion directly states that the background circumstances rule cannot be squared with the text of Title VII or the court's precedents. The court focused heavily on the text of Title VII, which protects any individual from discrimination. During oral arguments and in the final opinion, this textual focus was front and center. The opinion emphasizes that the law's focus on individuals rather than groups is anything but academic, and that Congress created the same protections for every individual, regardless of group membership. Another interesting aspect was how the justices questioned the lawyers. The petitioner's attorney, Mr. Wang, faced relatively few challenging questions. No justice engaged in extended back-and-forth questioning with Wang. This lack of intense scrutiny signaled early consensus that the background circumstances rule wasn't justified. In contrast, Ohio's attorney faced much tougher questioning. Justice Kagan directly confronted Ohio's Solicitor General about whether he was really defending the Sixth Circuit's reasoning. Justice Kavanaugh bluntly asked, "You agree that those passages are wrong?" Eventually, Ohio's lawyer had to concede that treating people differently based on protected characteristics was wrong, essentially abandoning defense of the rule while trying to win on other grounds. What's particularly striking was the petitioner's deliberate strategy to keep the case narrow. When Justice Gorsuch raised broader questions about problems with the entire McDonnell-Douglas framework, Wang politely redirected, "We're trying to focus just on this narrow question of whether this add-on to McDonnell-Douglas in the common cases is appropriate." This strategic focus paid off. The court delivered exactly the narrow ruling the petitioner requested, addressing only the background circumstances rule without reconsidering the broader framework. While the majority opinion was narrow, Justice Thomas's concurrence, joined by Justice Gorsuch, is where things get spicier. The concurrence picks up on concerns Justice Gorsuch raised during oral arguments about whether the McDonnell-Douglas framework makes sense at the summary judgment stage. Thomas writes that in a future case, he would be willing to consider whether the McDonnell-Douglas framework is a workable and useful evidentiary tool. The concurrence goes further than anything discussed at oral argument in criticizing judge-made rules that lack textual basis, exploring the difficulty of defining majority groups, and even commenting on corporate diversity initiatives. One interesting divergence. In closing arguments, Wang made an impassioned plea about equal justice under law, emphasizing that his client wanted not more justice, but certainly not less, and certainly not less because of the color of her skin, or because of her sex, or because of her religion. Yet the court's opinion remained technically focused on statutory interpretation rather than incorporating this emotional equality theme. The opinion sticks to legal analysis without the broader moral framing that concluded the oral argument. The court deliberately avoided addressing bigger questions that came up during oral arguments. Multiple justices questioned aspects of the McDonnell-Douglas framework. Justice Kavanaugh suggested it drops out once an employer states a reason. Justice Gorsuch noted the court never held it applies at summary judgment, and others questioned how its three steps interact. But the majority opinion sidesteps these larger questions entirely. The court explicitly notes that Ohio's alternative arguments would require us to resolve issues that the Court of Appeals did not address in the first instance and that fall beyond the scope of the question presented. This restraint aligns perfectly with Wang's statement during oral argument that this case wasn't the best vehicle to re-examine the broader framework. So that's the Ames case, a textbook example of how advocating for a narrow, focused ruling can lead to a unanimous victory at the Supreme Court, even while leaving bigger questions for another day. Hope you enjoyed this episode. If so, please follow, share, and review.